सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen though.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
I'm with Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary of India from January 2018 to 2020, a former ambassador to China from 2016 to 2017. And dear viewer, you will remember that during his tenure in China, the Doklam crisis took place in Bhutan, and we will come to that. But today we are talking about the 20th Party Congress that has begun in Beijing in China. It's going to go on for a week. And the reason we are discussing this is because Xi Jinping, the president of China, the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, and the chairman of China's military commission is likely to be re-anointed in all these three posts. But let me not get ahead of myself and welcome Mr. Gokhale to ThePrint. Mr. Gokhale, welcome.
Thank you, Jyoti. It's a pleasure to be on your program.
So, Ambassador Gokhale, the first question to you is that the Chinese Communist Party Congress has begun. It's going to go on for a week. But why should we care? Why should India care? As an Indian citizen, what is it to me whether the Communist Party has its party congress or not, and what it does in it?
This is an annual 5-year affair. This is a 5-year affair. And it is important because in the absence of a free media and a free flow of information, it is at such events that the international community as well as the Chinese people get a clear understanding of the achievements, the problems, and the way forward that China's leadership looks at. And since China is, after all, the world's second largest economy and in the Indo-Pacific region a major power, it should therefore be a report or a speech of interest to all of us in India.
So, there's several sort of reports out already on his speech, on the speech that he delivered to the party congress, and he makes a few points. This is Xi Jinping makes a few points. The first is that the campaign against corrupt officials, the cleanup of the environment, the crackdown on anti-government protests in Hong Kong, and he describes China's foreign policy as a series of successes in fending off Western bullying. What do you think he means by that?
So I think first, it is important to appreciate, Jyoti, that the report that he presents to the party congress is not addressed to an international audience.
Okay.
His primary objective is to address his own people, the Chinese people, and essentially to give them a report about what was achieved in the last 10 years since he assumed the top position, and also presumably to prepare for the coming 5 years, where, as you stated at the outset, it is expected that he is likely to continue as the General Secretary and as the President of China. Now, if this is the proposition, then we must read that speech putting on a pair of spectacles as if we are the Chinese people.
Okay.
And essentially what he is doing in the speech is messaging them about the challenges through which China has come out in the past 10 years. That includes the COVID crisis, it includes economic issues, it includes foreign policy challenges, it includes a worsening international security environment, and the listing of what the President and General Secretary has done in order to meet those challenges, and also to exhort the Chinese people to prepare for the coming challenges. Okay. So any statement that he makes on the risks and challenges that China faces, whether it is in the domestic sphere or the international sphere, must be seen in this context. We tend sometimes to take these words out of context.
Okay.
And then they look either weak or menacing, depending on who is looking at those words. But if you look at it in the context of the speech, the essential message he is giving is that the past 5 years have been difficult both from the domestic and international perspective. These difficulties or challenges have not risen because of what happened in China by the Chinese government but by what has happened nationally or internationally as a result of the worsening economic climate or the geopolitical or geostrategic climate, and that China has faced up to these challenges fairly well and in a manner which has preserved Chinese dignity, Chinese honor, and China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is basically the underlying message of this very long 2-hour speech.
But Master Gokhale, do you agree with that? What is your assessment of what he said in terms of the context that you talk about?
Well, I would really point to a couple of things. And it is important here to contrast what he said in 2017 when he addressed the 19th Party Congress and what he says today when he addresses the 20th Party Congress.
Okay.
He makes two essential points. The first point he makes is that there has been a fundamental shift in the global geopolitical situation.
Mm-hmm.
In 2017, if you look at his speech, it has a generally optimistic undertone.
Okay.
He talks of multipolarity. He talks of a world moving towards balance. He talks of a strategic window for China to achieve its goals for 2022, which is to eradicate poverty, and 2049, which is to make China a moderately prosperous society.
And this is all he said in 2017, so that's 5 years ago.
Indeed.
Okay.
Now, 2022, he paints a very different picture. He talks of grave risks in the international arena. He talks of certain domestic economic problems that have been faced not because China created them, but because this was due to international circumstances, whether it is the pandemic, whether it is the problem of protectionism, whether it is the anti-globalization movement. These are all challenges that he is facing. And he also goes on to say that there are attempts to blackmail China, to contain China,
like
to blockade China, which is a very different message from the 2017 speech, which says multipolarity is growing and the world is becoming more balanced. So in a sense, it is a reality check to his own people and to his own government and to his own party that going ahead from 2022, China is going to face headwinds, both domestically and internationally, and must be prepared for that.
What do you think he's referring to, this very somber picture that he's painting and that you're alluding to? What do you think, what are these grave risks that he's talking about?
Well, he's listed quite a few of them out if you read the speech.
Yeah.
The first point he has made essentially is that while he has greatly strengthened and reinvigorated the Communist Party of China, there are still problems. And you alluded to one of them, and that is the problem of corruption, of rent seeking, of privilege seeking, of wavering in the political commitment by party members to the ideology of the Communist Party.
Okay.
So he still sees this as a challenge that needs to be dealt with in the next 5 years.
But yeah,
economically,
go ahead. Sorry.
Economically speaking, he has said that there are still structural problems in the economy that need to be handled. And in this context, he has talked of the challenges China is going to face in the coming years because of protectionism and anti-globalization. Now, we must bear in mind that China's double-digit growth between 1990 and 2015 was precisely because they took advantage of a globalized world where free trade was the norm. He is now preparing his people to say that we need to depend on domestic consumption, on domestic industry, on domestic demand. We need to prepare and restructure industry to bring down the export-led growth element and to increase the domestic element. And we need to deal with certain other issues, including a non-favorable international economic environment. And as far as national security is concerned, I think his speech is very clear. He talks of the fact that there are others practicing hegemony and small group politics. China, on the other hand, is opposed to hegemony. China is willing to, has a development-oriented foreign policy and is willing to create a community for the shared future of mankind. So I think it's quite clear on all fronts.
But who do you think he's referring to when he talks about other countries practicing hegemony?
Well, he's been careful not to name any countries.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to note that whenever Chinese leaders speak, either at the Party Congress or at the National People's Congress, they generally do not refer to countries. But if you read between the lines, it is fairly obvious that their principal concern is with the United States and the American-led Western order.
So if it is the United States and the American-led Western group, which presumably includes Europe, but the fact remains that trade with the US and trade with Europe has gone up, in fact, during the pandemic in these last couple of years. So isn't that a contradiction in terms?
I think there is a lag effect between the measures that the West is taking and their impact on China's export figures or the inbound foreign investment. And we must be clear that when you are dealing with an $18 trillion economy, no country in the world can afford to completely decouple from China, simply because China dominates a number of the global supply chains. Nonetheless, I think if you see the recent announcements in the United States, the CHIPS Act, the export control policy on semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment, the warnings that Joseph Borrell, the EU High Representative, has given recently about China being a systemic rival and so on, the announcement that the Europeans must not put all their eggs in one basket where their economic relationship with Asia is concerned. I think President Xi Jinping, quite rightly, is preparing the Chinese people for a very different situation from that which has prevailed in the past 30 years, when their growth was essentially fueled by Western money, Western technology, and Western demand.
So do you see that the West is trying to sort of slowly decouple itself, and do you feel that this is the way to go? Because if, coming off the COVID pandemic, when the economy all around, including in India, but because India is also sort of increasingly globalized and integrated with the world, it seems as if that these headwinds is going to impact all the entire world, including India.
Well, there will be selective decoupling. As I mentioned a little earlier, you can't completely decouple from an $18 trillion economy. But I think the objective of Western decoupling is to ensure that the technological edge that the United States and the West still holds will remain in the foreseeable future. I also want to mention here, Jyoti, that the decoupling is not entirely being driven by the West. China has also been selectively decoupling over the past decade under President Xi Jinping. When you ban international search engines or international internet engines like Google and Facebook, when you develop an alternative GPS system called P2, when you develop alternative payment methods and methods of financial transactions such as WeChat or Union Pay, this too, in a sense, is decoupling from the international economy or from the Western-led economy. So I think there is selective decoupling on both sides. Of course, it will have an impact for the rest of the world, including for us. And therefore, I think it is extremely important for us to look at this speech, to look at the party Congress. But here I must put a word of caution. We need to look at it from our eyes and from our perspective, and not simply adopt the Western perspective or Western interpretations of what is being said in the speech or what is happening at the Congress.
So how do you look at it from your eyes or from India's eyes?
Well, as I said, first, this is a speech aimed at a domestic audience.
Right.
Therefore, when I see Western, or I shouldn't say Western reports, when I see foreigners talking about describing the speech as one which emphasizes continuity or no real departure from the past, I think they are making a mistake, because the speech is not intended to outline China's hard policies and strategic objectives. It is a speech intended for public consumption to assure the people that there are challenges ahead and that the Communist Party is capable of tackling them. Secondly, I think the president has been quite clear in outlining the problems: political issues, economic restructuring, national security related issues, ideological problems, and so on, and has also laid out a path to addressing them. But what is important to note is that he has touched on issues which in the 21st century will impact on people's lives. He has talked about the social security system. He has talked about the environmental issues. He has talked about digital connectivity. These are all issues which also concern all of us in India. And we must therefore assume that when he talks of these things, he is talking to his own people and telling them that he is on top of issues which are going to influence and sort of shape people's lives in the coming 10 years. And of course, the final message is a clear message on national security, which is that irrespective of the challenges we might face, we have dealt with Hong Kong, we have handled Taiwan well, we have built the military up, we have the capacity to protect ourselves, and the people of China need not be worried about any undermining of national security interests from the outset.
So let me ask the India question. You know, you say that we should look at it from the Indian point of view or through India's eyes. Now, just a few weeks ago, the Indian and the Chinese armies have disengaged in eastern Ladakh. They are going back to their status quo, the points where they were before. Well, the Chinese are going back. So this is happening all under Xi Jinping. 2 years ago, when the Chinese army went to the line of actual control, it was also under Xi Jinping. So what are we to understand from this?
Well, I'm not going to comment on what is happening on the line of actual control.
Okay, sure.
But I think that the speech contains certain elements which we need to be aware of. And that is both on the economic side and on the national security side. On the economic side, I think the Chinese have indicated that they intend to keep the global supply chain open, but in certain core technologies, they are going to be more careful of how these technologies are shared with others. And to that extent, our dependency on China in terms of getting advanced economic related technology might need a rethink. On the national security side, he has said quite clearly in his speech that he intends to build up strategic deterrence, which in effect means that Chinese will now substantially increase their nuclear arsenal. He has clearly said that he is going to focus on combat readiness and combat preparedness to win local wars. Now, in the past, the definition of the word local war has essentially involved wars in the periphery, and we are in the periphery. And also that in terms of national security, China will oppose what they call the Cold War mentality, the system of alliances, and most importantly, the building of small cliques targeted against specific countries. And I think, or I presume, although he has not said so explicitly, that this also includes the Quad. So I think there are a number of takeaways for us from this speech. I'm just listing a few. The point I want to emphasize again is we as Indian citizens need to read the speech. We don't need to read Western interpretations of it. We need to take cognizance of what is being said and not being said, and then apply it in whatever aspect of life we sort of pursue.
So two questions from that. You said that India is part of the periphery, or as China sees it. Is that what it is? And what does that mean?
Well, we are a peripheral state, aren't we? We share a common border.
Yeah.
And as China's strategic periphery widens, which is inevitable because it is an $18 trillion economy with a very substantial military capability, the periphery or the proximate regions come under pressure. So I think this is a natural aspect of geopolitics and something we should be prepared for. And in that context, if we read the small portion of national security that Xi Jinping has spoken about in terms of outlining the goals for the next 5 to 10 years, then I think the signal to me is that we need to prepare for a continuing sort of build-up on the border, not just with India, in China's entire periphery, and deal with whatever challenges this might throw up, because China is indicating both that it will strengthen its conventional capability and its strategic deterrence.
So what the Quad question, how does what is he saying? Of course, he doesn't mention the Quad, but what is he saying about the Quad and the challenges that he thinks that the big powers that are now there in his periphery, how does he deal with that?
Well, we need to be careful not to overinterpret his speech, Jyoti. He has not talked about the Quad at all. I think he has talked about the broader international environment and the situation in which China finds itself, which is that efforts, and he has used the word external attempts to blackmail, contain, and blockade and suppress China will increase. I think he is, as I said, he is talking to his people, he is not talking to us. And what he is telling his people is expect headwinds in the international space and prepare to deal with them. And he is assuring his people that the Chinese state and party are ready to deal with them. So I think we should not read too much into what he is trying to tell us indirectly on Quad. We should, in fact, be focusing on what he is preparing his own people for. And that gives us clues rather than, over-interpreting his speech on things he has not talked about.
So, Mr. Gokhale, how does this speech sound to you? Did he sound confident? Did he sound assertive? How did he sound?
I think he sounds very much as a leader who's preparing for another term in office. Because when he outlines the goals for the next 5 years, in which he talks about the need to continue what he has done in the past 10 years, then I presume the subterranean message is that he needs to continue to finish the job. So my sense is that in some way or another, his authority and power will remain intact. Now, of course, we know that constitutional amendments are likely to be introduced. There is some speculation that this might involve a change in title or nomenclature, a revival of the post or position of chairman of the Communist Party. I really don't have any information on whether this is going to happen or not. Let's wait for the end of the Congress to figure that out.
So that means if this constitutional amendment takes place, he could be called Chairman Xi. Is that right?
Well, technically, he is already called Chairman Xi because he is while we translate the word Chu Xi, which is the Chinese phrase as president, in Chinese language it is translated as chairman. The Chinese word for president is Zongtong. Therefore, they in any case in China address him as Chairman Xi. He also happens to be the chairman of the Central Military Commission, which is the top level military body. But yes, it is true that this will be a new meaning to the word chairman. Because till now there has only been one chairman of the Communist Party, and that has been Mao Zedong.
So you had Chairman Mao, and now you will have Chairman Xi.
Yes, if the constitutional amendment happens, and that, as I said, is pure speculation at this point.
So you started off our conversation today by saying that this is really his report to the nation, once in 5 years, because you don't have a free press in China. But when something like this happens, that that he's likely to be re-anointed for another 5 years or whatever it is. Now, how do you think the people respond to that?
Look, first, China isn't a democracy. So we don't know, we will never have an accurate understanding of how the Chinese respond to that. Secondly, we must be careful not to put on glasses as foreigners and try to interpret how the Chinese people look at their leaders. I have a number of anecdotal reports from those who have lived in China, saying that in the past 2 years, when the rest of the world went through a very traumatic time in 2020 and 2021, China passed through a very benign period when there was no masking, when there was a freedom of movement, and when there was normal economic activity. And even today, according to statistics, of course, statistics need not necessarily be accurate, but according to statistics, the number of fatalities is significantly less in China than in many other parts of the world. Now, I think the population does expect its government to take care of it, to the extent that this has been done, not just with respect to the pandemic, but also on the economy and on national security. We must be careful not to presume that there is massive public unhappiness with President Xi Jinping. Obviously, surveys done by the Chinese government indicate a huge popularity. I think that too should be discounted. But equally, we should discount assumptions from the social media about distress that certain citizens face and extrapolate it to mean that the entire Chinese population is very unhappy with the president. I want to specifically comment on an incident that happened a couple of days ago where a couple of rather provocative banners were unfurled at a major crossroad in Beijing. Now, you must appreciate that even the most authoritarian of states can't completely control dissent. But we must be equally careful in watching the situation and not over-interpreting it. It is true that when such public expressions take place, it might lead to a larger expression of public dissatisfaction. That is what happened in 1989. It began with a few posters in Beijing University, and ultimately we all were witness to what happened at Tiananmen Square. But we should not assume that every such small incident that occurs will lead to that. So essentially, my own sense is that the public opinion in China is more or less aligned to Xi Jinping's vision. There is clearly dissent and dissatisfaction within the party that is inevitable when a leader tries to stay on beyond what ought to be the end of his term according to norms set by his predecessors. But we have to wait for the new lineup on the 23rd of October to see whether Xi's power is absolute or whether others have the capacity to contain him. I don't mean contain him in any physical sense. The last comment I do want to say, however, is that when the Chinese leadership has tended to concentrate power in a single individual's hand, and this happened with Mao Zedong, you actually increase the risks of succession battles. So in a sense, if we were to judge by history, Mao's concentration of authority led to a succession struggle which in a sense destabilized China for some time. And therefore, I think we as observers from outside should also prepare for a possible succession battle 5 or 10 years down the road, which can be destabilizing. And when an 18 or a 20 or by then a $25 trillion economy undergoes such destabilization, it will have massive ripple effects across the world. This is not Mao Zedong with $500 billion, 200 or $300 billion economy. This is Xi Jinping with a $25 trillion economy.
So 5 to 10 years down the road would mean that Xi Jinping would be in power for another, perhaps 5 to 10 years, which means that at the end of that, he would have been in power for 20 years.
Well, Mao was in power from 1949 until he died in 1976. So, your guess is as good as mine as to whether Xi Jinping will continue that long and in what form he will continue. I'm just saying that general perceived wisdom is that he will certainly continue for 5 years. And when he talks of setting goals for 2035, there is a possibility that he will continue beyond 2027.
But Ambassador Gokhale, the Chinese people know, the world certainly knows, but the Chinese also know what Mao, of course, China became a much more powerful country under his leadership. But even whether you had the Cultural Revolution, you had the Great Leap Forward, there's so much pain that was brought under his leadership by people who did or didn't report to him. The question is that the Chinese know what a single person's rule can do to them. So therefore, wouldn't they be asking more questions rather than fewer ones?
I think we make a fundamental misperception in comparing Xi and Mao. And an editorial that I wrote for the Indian Express a couple of days ago makes this point. The fundamental difference is that Mao reveled in creating chaos, in destabilizing the political and cultural situation in China. Xi Jinping is very much a man of order. Like Deng Xiaoping and his successors, who were Xi Jinping's predecessors, the priority is social stability, stability above everything. And this, I believe, is what the Chinese population also thinks is important. And if you look at it from our perspective, I think all people in the world crave stability over everything else because you want predictability in your life. So while, of course, one man or one person rule does have certain risks going forward, because when that person leaves office, there is a power struggle. But it doesn't mean that there is instability while she or he is in power. And I think we need to understand that over the past 10 years, the Chinese have had a pretty stable, predictable existence under the president and General Secretary Xi Jinping. There is no reason to believe that this will not continue. He is not inciting major campaigns like the Great Leap Forward or the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which has completely disrupted everyone's life.
It sounds a bit like a parent-child relationship, isn't it? This emphasis on order, on stability, on sort of creating stability out of chaos, perhaps. But it's not like in India, for example, of course, our systems are so different, but you do challenge your leaders, you do ask them questions. I'm not even talking about the questions, but this parent-child type of relationship that Xi Jinping or the leader of the Communist Party has with its people, that's obviously what the Chinese people want.
Well, what the Chinese people want is something we might not know. But I think all authoritarian systems have a streak of paternalism in them. And that paternalism is inherent in an authoritarian system, because there is no way that the dictator has in judging people's sentiment towards them. The great advantage that we have in a democracy like India is that we go to the polls every 5 years and we vote. And leaders understand where they stand in the public affection. In the case of the Chinese, that is not so, and therefore they need to be paternalistic because it legitimizes, in a sense, their existence, since they are like fathers to their children and they are providing for them. So I don't think to that extent Xi Jinping or the Chinese Communist Party is any different from any other non-democratic or authoritarian system.
So last couple of questions. Explain to us the China-Russia relationship, especially in the light of the Russia-Ukraine war. Everybody says that, Russia is like the Chota Bhai, the younger brother of the Chinese. It's becoming a weaker state. Explain to us what's going on in global geopolitics.
Well, I mean, there are as many interpretations of what is happening between China and Russia as there are experts on the subject. So, and I am no expert on this subject. But what I feel is that while a certain dependency has grown on the Russian side as a result of Western sanctions and their implications on the Russian economy, we should be careful not to assume that it is a unidirectional dependency. I think equally there has been a growth in the dependency that the Chinese have had in Putin's continuing in power. Because as I think President Xi Jinping himself described it, there has never been a better time in China-Russia relations. And to the extent that the regime in Russia might weaken and it might lead to regime change or an external inducement of regime change takes place, I think China will be worse off, relatively speaking, than it is today. Therefore, it is also dependent on the survivability of Putin's regime to ensure its own geopolitical position in Eurasia. And so my sort of 2 bits worth is that there is a mutual dependency. We can argue about the relatively greater or lesser nature of that dependency, but we should be careful not to assume it is a one-way dependency.
On the US-China question, I know you talked about this increasing effort on the part of the Americans to decouple from China, but not so long ago, there was the G2, which is the US-China sort of coupling at the time, if you like, them coming closer together. So what are we to make of it? A few years ago, you had the G2, now you have the a decoupling, or at least an attempt at one. How does India understand this relationship?
That's something you have to ask the government. But what I can certainly say is that, at least the way I see it, is that there has been a fundamental reordering of perception and priorities on both sides. The Americans have clearly now labeled China as a strategic rival, even adversary. And the Chinese have also clearly signaled, although they haven't said this explicitly, that the United States represents an existential threat to the Communist Party. So in a sense, there is a greater sort of rivalry or even antagonism between the two largest economies and the two most powerful states in the world. That having been said, I think their economies are so interlinked financially, commercially, and in terms of manufacturing, that this will be a very different relationship from the US-Soviet one. Because they are both competing as well as cooperating in many areas. It's anybody's guess how this will pan out in the next few years. I think we all have to watch.
And how does India position itself? On the one hand, the US-India relationship is quite close. We know that over the last couple of years, especially since the two armies were facing off, Indian and Chinese, the India relationship with China is much more, shall we say, circumspect in some ways. How does India deal with this?
Well, I think our External Affairs Minister has talked of multi-alignment, and I think that single word encompasses Indian foreign policy for the last maybe 20 years. I don't see us deviating from that in any significant manner, although, as I said, I don't speak for the government and really don't know the government's mind on this.
So multi-alignment in what sense? India and the US coming closer together? How do you explain? How do you understand this?
Multi-alignment means multi-alignment. You build relations with all the major powers.
Including China?
Yes, including China. I think we have a relationship with them. And it's a fairly diverse relationship. We do, after all, have an economic relationship, a political relationship, and so on. So, and I don't hear anybody in India suggesting that we must break off that relationship. So that's part of the multi-alignment process.
I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there, and I'm sure that my viewers will agree that this has been a masterclass in understanding the Chinese leadership, the Chinese Communist Party. The party congress is going to take place over the next week or so, and I'm sure we will have you back, Ambassador Gokhale, to discuss and explain to us what's going on. But before I go, I'd like to show my viewers the book that Ambassador Vijay Gokhale has written. This is his third. It's called After Tiananmen, The Rise of China. So I suggest that all of you who are interested in the China story go out and buy it. Thank you so much, Ambassador Gokhale, for your time.
Thank you, Jyoti. It was a pleasure. Thank you.